The spear had gone clean through his leg. Somewhere in the highlands of what is now Borneo, 43,000 years ago, a young man lay on a bed of leaves, blood pooling beneath a wound that should have killed him within days. No antibiotics, no stitches, no hospital. Just a small group of people crouched around him in the dark, doing something no one expected hunter-gatherers of that era to be capable of. They amputated his leg. And he lived. He lived for years afterward, long enough for the bone to heal, remodel, and smooth over at the site of the cut. When archaeologists pulled his skeleton out of a limestone cave in 2022, it broke almost everything we thought we understood about ancient medicine. Because here's the question nobody could answer at first. How does a Stone Age human survive an injury that modern trauma surgeons, with all their tools, would still call life-threatening? We like to imagine our ancestors as fragile. One broken bone, one deep wound, one infection, and that was supposed to be the end. Survival of the fittest, and the wounded simply didn't make the cut. That's the story we've been told for over a century. But the deeper researchers dig, literally, the more that story falls apart. Go back further, tens of thousands of years before that Borneo amputee, to the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iraq. In a cave called Shanidar, archaeologists found the skeleton of a Neanderthal man, now known as Shanidar I, who lived around 45,000 years ago. His skeleton reads like a list of catastrophes: a crushing blow to the skull that likely blinded him in one eye, a withered, partially amputated arm, signs of a leg injury that would have left him with a severe limp, hearing loss so advanced that in the wild, alone, it would have been a death sentence. He should not have made it to adulthood, let alone into his 40s or 50s, which is roughly how old he was when he died. But he did, and that means someone kept him alive.
Think about what that actually requires. Not just sympathy, not just a moment of kindness. It requires food being brought to a person who could not hunt. It requires wounds being cleaned, possibly with plant matter that had antiseptic properties. It requires someone watching over him during fevers, through infections, through the agony of healing without anesthesia. For years, maybe for decades. This wasn't an accident of survival. This was a system. And that's where the story gets stranger, because the deeper you look, the more it seems like early humans weren't improvising their care. They were practicing it, repeating it, passing it down. Rewind further still, to a time before any of this, before humans had settled anywhere, before there were caves full of the injured being nursed back to health. Early hominins living on the open savannas of Africa were, by every measure, extraordinarily vulnerable. Thin skin, slow reflexes compared to the predators around them, no claws, no fangs, no armor. A twisted ankle wasn't an inconvenience out there. It was often a countdown. For a long time, the assumption was simple. If you couldn't keep up, you were left behind. Nature is efficient that way. Except the fossil record kept producing skeletons that shouldn't exist under that rule. Individuals with healed fractures, skulls with healed depression wounds, spines showing signs of illnesses that would have left a person bedridden for weeks, and yet the bone had time to remodel, which meant the person had time to heal. Something changed. Somewhere between leave the wounded behind and carry them for miles, feed them for years, and bury them with flowers, a turning point happened. And it wasn't a single invention. It was a slow, radical shift in what it meant to be part of a group. The turning point, many researchers now argue, wasn't a tool or a technique, it was an idea. The idea that a member of the group was still worth keeping even when they could no longer contribute. That idea, once it took hold, changed the trajectory of the entire species. And once it existed, the medical sophistication that followed is almost hard to believe. Consider trepanation, the practice of cutting or drilling a hole into the skull. It sounds like a horror story, and in the wrong hands it would have been. But archaeologists have found trepan skulls from thousands of years ago across multiple continents, from Peru to France to China, where the bone edges show clear signs of healing. That means the patient survived the surgery, not once in a rare fluke, but repeatedly across cultures that had no contact with each other. Some sites in ancient Peru
Peru show survival rates estimated as high as 80 to 90% for certain periods, numbers that would be respectable even by the standards of battlefield surgery centuries later. Then there's the evidence for splinting. Healed fractures found in ancient skeletons frequently show remarkably straight alignment, the kind you'd expect from a limb that had been immobilized, not one that healed in whatever crooked position it happened to land in. That means someone understood, intuitively or through hard experience, that bones need to be held still to knit properly. That knowledge had to come from somewhere. It had to come from watching, from failing, from trying again. And then there's the part that surprises people most, the plants. Archaeologists studying dental plaque and residue on ancient tools have found traces of medicinal plants with anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties, used in ways that suggest they weren't random. Neanderthal remains in Spain showed evidence of poplar, which contains a compound chemically related to aspirin, alongside a mold known to produce natural antibiotics. This wasn't a modern human innovation. It predates us as a species being the only ones doing it. What that means is staggering. Long before anyone wrote a word about medicine, long before the first doctor as we'd recognize one, they were people in caves and on open plains figuring out, through trial, error, grief, and observation, how to keep each other alive. There's another detail that rarely makes it into the textbooks, and it might be the strangest piece of the whole puzzle. Some of these healed injuries weren't from accidents at all. Researchers examining certain skeletons have found wounds consistent with violence, deep cuts, blunt trauma to the skull, punctures that lined up with weapons rather than falls or animal attacks, and yet the bone shows healing. Someone was hurt badly enough to nearly die, possibly by another person, and still, afterward, someone else cared for them until they recovered. Even in a world without written law, without courts, without any of the structures we now use to hold a society together, there seems to have been an instinct to patch people back up rather than simply let violence run its course. Then there's the question of pain itself, something almost impossible to study from bones alone, yet impossible to ignore. Setting a fracture without anesthesia, cutting into a skull with a stone tool while the patient was conscious, every one of these procedures would have been agonizing for the person being treated and for the person doing the treating who had to keep working through screams they couldn't silence. That detail changes how you should picture these scenes. It wasn't clinical. It wasn't clean. It was raw, desperate, and deeply human, carried out by people who had no guarantee it would work and who did it anyway. But here's the part that changes how you should think about all of this. It wasn't really about medicine at all. Not first. It was about care. The willingness to carry someone, to feed someone who couldn't hunt, to sit beside someone through a fever that might not break. The techniques came later. The instinct to not let someone die alone came first, and it may be one of the oldest human behaviors we have physical proof of. Some researchers now argue that this, more than fire, more than tools, more than language, is what actually set our lineage apart. Other animals show flashes of altruism. Elephants mourn. Chimpanzees comfort each other. But the sustained, deliberate, months and years-long commitment to nursing another individual back from catastrophic injury, that pattern shows up again and again in the human fossil record in a way it simply doesn't elsewhere. It also explains something that has puzzled anthropologists for decades: why early human groups, small and constantly exposed to danger, didn't collapse the moment their strongest members got hurt. A hunting party is only as good as its healthiest hunters. Except the record shows communities absorbing the cost of caring for the injured again and again, and somehow still surviving generation after generation. The math only works if that care wasn't a burden the group tolerated. It was a strategy. Wounded members who survived carried knowledge, memory, relationships, and skills that a group couldn't afford to lose. Keeping them alive wasn't sentimental. It was, in its own brutal way, an evolutionary advantage. And it's still working exactly the same way today. Every time a hospital keeps someone alive who, in a harsher world, would have simply been left behind. Every time a stranger performs CPR on someone they've never met. Every time a community rallies around the person who can no longer care for themselves. That instinct, the one etched in the healed bones of a Neanderthal in Iraq and a young man in a Borneo cave, never left us. It just changed shape. Modern medicine likes to tell its own origin story, starting with ancient Greece, with Hippocrates and his oath, with the first written medical texts. But the bones say otherwise. They say the story starts tens of thousands of years earlier, in complete silence, with no written record at all. Only the physical proof left behind, and healed fractures and reshaped skulls. Every splint, every plant poultice, every hand that held a fevered body still through the night. All of it happened long before anyone had a word for medicine, and none of it was written down. It didn't need to be. It was carried instead, generation to generation, body to body, in the simple repeated act of refusing to give up on someone. We think of medicine as a modern invention, something built in laboratories with machines that beep and screens that glow. But its true origin isn't in a lab at all. It's in the dark of a cave tens of thousands of years ago, where a person too broken to hunt, too wounded to walk, was fed anyway, was cleaned anyway, was kept warm anyway. Long before anyone called it medicine, someone simply refused to let them go. And in a strange, quiet way, every single one of us alive today is a descendant of that choice.